So we're going to go ahead and get started. Can y'all hear this mic as well? Yes. I'm going to move this one back. So one, let me thank the elders for allowing me to come up and speak to you guys tonight. Also, Jack for asking me to do this. I appreciate the opportunity. You know, they say the saying is they always save the best for last. If that's what you thought tonight, you're going to be very disappointed because you already had Richard and Trevor and Rhett and Chris. So they did not save the best for last. So I will apologize up front for that. So, but hopefully I give you something to think about tonight with Pilate. Before we get started, let's say a word of prayer. Our dear Father, we thank you for this evening you've given us. We thank you for this opportunity we have to come and worship you in spirit and in truth. I pray, dear Lord, that the things that I say tonight will be in accordance to your word and pleasing to you, that I'll have a ready recollection of the things I've studied, that I'll present these things in a manner that is easy to understand and that we can apply them to our lives and take them out to the world in which we live. We also ask, dear Lord, to be at those families that are suffering tonight with the loss of their children and loved ones in Texas. We know that they're suffering in a way that we can't imagine. We just ask that you comfort them as only you can. We thank you for your son Jesus and the sacrifice that he was willing to make for us. And all this we pray in your son's name, Jesus. Amen. So before we start, I'm going to share you a story. And the story is, my son's not in here, and I was really hoping he would be in here, but he's not. So Nick, when Nick was about 4 years old, 5 years old, very little, he and I were home by ourselves, and I was fixing him lunch. Lisa's heard this story 1,000 times. We share it with everybody we can. But Nick and I was sitting on the couch eating a peanut butter sandwich. And you're probably already thinking, how does a peanut butter sandwich have anything to do with Pilate? So I'm hoping I can tie this together. But as Nick and I are sitting there eating, Nick, like a lot of 4-year-olds, gets peanut butter in his fingers, and he proceeds to do that. I looked at Nick, I said, Nick, don't wipe your hands on your shirt. He said, yes, Daddy, I won't. Cool, we're good to go. 4 or 5 minutes later, he does it again. Nick, don't wipe your hands on your shirt. Yes, sir, I won't. 4 or 5 more minutes goes by, he does it for the 3rd time. At this point, I am now frustrated. Nick, what are you doing? Don't wipe your hands on your shirt. I'm not. Nick, I just saw you do it. Daddy, this is not my shirt. This is Jack's shirt. Now, how does that tie to this lesson? It doesn't tie specific to the lesson, but it ties to the character studies. As I thought about these character studies, one, these are real people. But sometimes, just like I did with Nick, I made an assumption that Nick understood the English language the same way I did. Because we understand that when I said your shirt, the shirt you're wearing is the one I imply. He's 4 years old. He doesn't understand. His knowledge is different than mine. I think we do the same thing with sometimes with the different characters that we read about in the Bible. Well, we have Genesis all the way to Revelations. We have the full context, and we go, yeah, I wouldn't do that, or I'd have done it different. And I think when we start putting these studies together, I know for me, when I thought about Pilate, I kind of had an idea who this guy was. But as I started studying and reading and getting from his perspective, my idea somewhat changed. Now, I'm not here tonight to tell you that he's a good guy, because he's not. But my thoughts about Pilate changed a little bit. Does anybody here, when I say the word Pilate, do you already think of a way you would describe him? I know I did. Raise your hand if you have a preconceived idea of who Pilate is. I think we all do, and we could probably do that with every character that we go through with the Bible. We can say, oh, I think I know who that person is based on what I read, or what he did, or what he didn't do. So before we go into the scriptures, I'm going to give you a little bit of who he was and what he was, because I think that's very important for us to understand, because at the end of the day, the scriptures don't give us a lot of information. The accounts of Pilate are obviously in all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm going to spend most of my time tonight in John. But there's not a lot about Pilate of who he was. We know what he did or what he didn't do, but we don't know who he was. And so I'm going to be very upfront and honest. Some of this is going to be coming from secular history. It's going to be coming from outside the Bible. And so some of it may be very accurate. Some of it is assumptions. Some of it is not as accurate. And I'll try to let you know on the ones that are less accurate, there's controversy, if you will. So who was Pontius Pilate? Well, we know he was the 5th governor of the Roman province of Judea. He served under Emperor Tiberius for about 10 years. And although he typically resided in Caesarea, at this time during what we read in the Bible, he was in Jerusalem for the Passover. And this is when he was brought to, and this is when Jesus was brought before him. We also know that this, Josephus states that Pilate governed for 10 years, that made him two of the longest serving governors of the province. What does Pilate mean? So some say it might mean skilled with a javelin or a pilum, but it also could refer to the palace or the Phrygian cap, which may indicate that one of Pilate's ancestors was a freed man, or at one point his family were slaves. So what type of power did what kind of power did Pilate have? So again, there's different sources for this. Some of it we can look into the scriptures for, and we're going to talk about, but there's also other sources. So the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia said that Pilate possessed civil, military, and criminal jurisdiction. Why is that important? Not all the prefects or the governors at the time all had the same type of authority. And he had all three of these types of authorities based on what the history says. His title does imply that his primary power was military power, but the military, as we think of, is a little bit different. Here, military was more like a police force. So they were there to enforce laws. But he also, as I said earlier, extended beyond the military. So he also, as the governor, he was head of the judicial system. So he did have the power to inflict capital punishment. He was responsible for collecting, imposing taxes, also dispersing funds. And also there's some thought that he minted coins under his rule. The Romans allowed the Sanhedrin of the Jews to have some type of laws, so they had a judicial system, and they were allowed to have some power. And so again, Pilate was sharing some of this with the Jews. We're going to see in a little bit that probably caused problems. He was not a Jew. He didn't like the Jews didn't like him. There's thought that Pilate was most likely educated, probably from military. He became well connected politically and socially. We know that he was married. His wife is referenced once. We don't know much about her, who she was. There's thoughts that very likely she also came from either politically or socially connected, but again, we don't know that. We do know that she had a dream. Many believe that Pilate would have had a military command before he became the governor of Judea. Again, it's thought, but not certain. I talked to Jack about this last week. As I studied this, his number one priority, if you said summarize it, was to keep the peace. That was his job. I'm supposed to keep the peace. And you say, well, that's obvious. He's the governor. Well, when we read these accounts of this trial, and you start thinking about his role is to keep the peace. Is his role to keep the peace for the Jews? Nope. He didn't care about the Jews. He cares about them in the sense that they're under his rule, but he's keeping the peace because he doesn't want it to get back to Caesar. So he's doing it because I don't want this to get back to anybody else. So from his perspective, I got to keep the peace. Now, he could do that in many different ways. Again, some of the Jewish scholars tell us that they think he did it in some very vicious ways. There's actually some doubts that was actually true. But again, he had different ways he could keep the peace. We do know that Romans, the government, had basically no tolerance for sedition or rebellion against their government. But we also know the Jews, they had religious reasons for resisting the Roman control. The Romans expected the Jews to worship their emperor almost as if he was a god. That wasn't part of their belief. And we believe that Pontius Pilate, he had little tolerance for Jewish traditions. If you go into the first account, well, not the first, but before, so we go to Luke 13, verse 1, it says, there were present at that season some who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. So this is one time that Pilate is mentioned that has nothing to do with the trial of Jesus. But we already know that during a religious ceremony, a sacrifice, he was killing Galileans. So he wasn't a very nice guy. Now, why he killed them, we do not know. Again, if you look at, so Josephus, he says that they believe, or I think he writes, that at that time that there was riots, and he was doing that to control riots, and they were rebelling against the Romans. But again, there's no really proof of that in the scriptures. The other thing that Pilate had to do, he had to try to please the people, but he had to do it without breaking Roman law. So his job was pretty delicate. So here I am, I'm trying to please the people. Some are Romans, some are Jews. I don't want to get back to my bosses. Again, why is that important? Well, if I'm Pilate and I got somebody that has my job on the line, that I'm trying to make sure that you are happy, but you don't really like me, but I got to please you and you. So he's got a pretty delicate job. Got to keep a lot of people happy and people that he may not like. So I think, again, I'm trying to give us something to think about. When we read about him, he made decisions and choices and words that he chose because he's trying to keep the peace. That is what he's trying to do. But he also knows that he has laws that he's supposed to uphold. So the other thing we're going to talk about real quick is the Sanhedrin. Chris spoke about that last week. And you say, well, again, why is that important when it comes to Pilate? Well, I think it's important to understand, and many of you all probably know this, but for me, reading about it made me put a different perspective again on what Pilate was dealing with. So the Sanhedrin, the supreme tribal council of the Jews, they were allowed to self-govern as long as it was consistent with the maintenance of the imperial authority or the Roman government. Concerning the Sanhedrin courts, they were still bound by Jewish law. So, for example, even though they were under the Romans, they still, when they're in their council, they're still going by Jewish law. So why does that matter? Well, when you get into the trial of Pilate and the trial of Jesus, one thing is they're supposed to have witnesses, and they didn't. So they're supposed to have a witness to come forward to say what Jesus did, and that didn't happen. Supposed to have two of them. They didn't have any. So Pilate probably somewhat understands Jewish law, but they're coming to him and asking him to do something that they don't have authority to do. So here's a few things about Jewish law that happened that night that should not have happened. Arrest could not be made at night. The time and the date of the trial were illegal because it took place on the eve of the Sabbath, and that time precluded any opportunity for the required adjournment to the next day in the event of a conviction. The Sanhedrin were without authority to instigate charges. It was only supposed to be to investigate the charges. But we know in this trial they instigated these charges. The court didn't meet in the regular meeting place of the Sanhedrin, which is also required by law. And the Sanhedrin itself pronounced the death sentence. So during Roman captivity, they weren't allowed to do that. They weren't allowed to have the death penalty. They weren't allowed to do it. What's interesting, I don't know how many of you know this, but they did have a death penalty before they came under Roman law. What was their death penalty? Does anybody know? Was it crucifixion? It was stoning. So if they would have been allowed to actually give a death penalty sentence and carry it out, it would have been stoning, not crucifixion, because that's what they would have done. Again, the Bible prophecy tells us that's not what's going to happen. So again, they were not allowed to carry out their laws. Anybody have any comments before we go? We're going to start in John 18. Anybody have any comments or any thoughts? Anything else around the things I mentioned? All right. So we're going to start in John 18. We're going to start, we're down to 20, we're going to start in verse 26. So John 18, verse 26. So one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter denied again. Immediately a rooster crowed. 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled. but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, would we not have delivered him up to you?" Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your laws." So let's just stop for a second. So here's Pilate. He doesn't like the Jews. They don't like him. They won't even go where he is because it would defile them and they can't take Passover. So he has to come out to where they are. I'm thinking this right here has already made him mad. I'm having to go out and meet you where you are. You're bringing an issue to me. I really don't want to have to deal with this. This is your issue, not Roman issue. When he asked them, "What charges do you bring against this man?" what did they say?
He hadn't done something wrong, would we have brought him before you?
They had no charge. Basically, the defense was, well, we wouldn't be here if there wasn't something wrong. And his point was, okay, well, then you take care of it. Take him back to your courts. At this point, they had already determined earlier that they had already determined they were going to put him to death. So therefore the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die." Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" So now the Jews are wanting to put Jesus to death, and they're not allowed to do that. But they've already put the charge. So at this point, Pilate doesn't know the charge. All he's been told is, hey, he's been found guilty under our laws, and we want to put him to death. He doesn't know what the charge is. So now he's trying to uncover that. Now I'm going to draw some speculation, so I can't tell you. Some other ones may be able to tell me more than I know. But I'm thinking this is Pilate's role. As I said earlier, his role is to keep the peace. Trying to keep things calm. I don't want things getting out of hand. I already know under law that I don't really have the authority to put this man to death, but y'all are demanding it. Not really what I want to do. He's trying to do everything he can, as we see going forward, not to do it. He doesn't want to put Jesus to death at this point. That's not what he wants to do. He wants this to go away. He wants to, and we know that, he wants to get away from me. Just take this somewhere else. That's his goal. Anybody have any thoughts before we move on? Anybody can have comments? Anything? Nothing? All right. So again, Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you concerning me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests have delivered you to me. So what have you done?" So, at this point, there's some that think that he was almost mocking Jesus at this point by saying, "Am I a Jew?" I don't think he was. I think he's asking the question like, I'm not the one bringing these charges to you. I'm not a Jew. I'm not the one that did this. So now you're going to have to tell me what's going on. That's how I interpret that question. But there's some that think he's mocking him. I read that as more of, I didn't do this. You're here before me because of your people. I didn't come find you. I didn't have an issue with you. So tell me what's going on. Jesus answered, well, you did say to him, he goes, well, what do you know? Do you know this for yourself, or did somebody tell you? Well, we already know that somebody is telling Pilate all these things. So Pilate then said, what have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. So Pilate therefore said to him, Are you a king then? Jesus answered, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So again, we have this banter back and forth between Jesus and Pilate. He's trying to understand, what does Jesus mean by the word king? So remember, he's not a Jew. They're using the term king. Is he saying he's the king of Rome? Which he's not. Is he saying he's the king of the Jews? That's what he's trying to determine. Again, they're asking him, the Jews are asking Pilate to crucify this guy. He's trying to understand, can you tell me the charge? Because they don't want to. They had the opportunity, they refused. So Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. So what's interesting about this, and I'd be interested if anybody has comments, that particular verse, what is truth? I looked up a lot of commentaries about that, and there was a lot of speculation on what Pilate was actually trying to say. Was he being sarcastic? Was he being sincere? Was he mocking Jesus? I'm not sure I know the answer there. I think he's trying to understand what the truth is, and I think he's trying to get Jesus to tell him. Jack, do you have a thought on that by any chance?
I think he's confused.
Yeah.
Too. Because he's not the king, so he's not sedition. There's no sedition there.
Yep.
If he'd say, I'm a king, well, Rome appoints the kings. So that'd be sedition. And then he says talks about truth. I think I'd be confused. What is truth? What are you talking about? Truth?
Yep.
It's an interesting conversation, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think he's trying to uncover, again, why am I here? Why are you here? Can you help me? I'm not understanding your language. I'm not understanding what you're telling me. I'm sure he had heard of Jesus. That's pretty certain. But Jesus' teachings, I'm not sure how familiar he was with Jesus' teachings. We don't have any indication of what Pilate knew or didn't know. So, the verse 39, but you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews? They all cried again, saying, no, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. So now we're going to go to chapter 19. So again, he is trying to release Jesus. He has one person that was a robber. He was convicted. He is known thief. There's no question what he did. The Jews know it. Pilate knows it. He's an easy one to convict. Jesus, Pilate's like, I don't have anything against this guy. I don't have any charges against him. He's asking the Jews, give me the opportunity to release a guy that I don't find any fault with. They don't want him to, so he doesn't. He keeps Jesus. So now we go to chapter 19. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, Hail, the King of the Jews! And they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. Does anybody have any thoughts about why he did that? Like, why did he just take that crown of thorns and pound on his head? What was his purpose for doing that?
Well, I almost feel like, as odd as it sounds, I almost feel he's trying to save him. It's like, well, maybe if they see me beat him, humiliate him, maybe that'll be enough to satisfy whatever they have against this guy. And maybe once they do that, okay, now let's let him go. We've done enough. That's kind of how I see it.
And that's exactly how when I started studying and reading it, I think, again, he did something cruel. But to the point of, if I do this, is that enough? Because I still think he's trying to, get out of crucifying someone that he hasn't found anything wrong with. So what you said, I think he's looking, again, here, I've done something to him. I punished him. Would that be enough to satisfy your need to punish this man? They, again, want to kill him. So I agree with you. Anybody else, any thoughts, any different? Well, he'd been sentenced by the Sanhedrin already. They had crucified him. Not crucified him. They had already sentenced him. They wanted him to die. So at that point, they're now asking Pilate here. They're asking Pilate to put him to death or to crucify him. And Pilate, the whole time, up until this point and a few more times, keeps saying, I haven't found anything to kill him for. There's no reason to crucify this guy. There's no reason to put him to death. But I also gave you the opportunity to take this robber, this known thief, and let me punish him and let Jesus go. And they didn't want to do that. So again, he was looking for a way out. So I think on that situation, Pilate had not at that point said, I'm going to crucify. No. Matter of fact, getting down to 12 minutes, but somewhere between here, we know that Pilate sends Jesus to Herod, and that account is in, I'm going to read it real quick. So in Luke, we know that Pilate sent Jesus to Herod. And the only reason I'm reading this is, again, Herod, verse 8, now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him. And he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Well, then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, so his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. And that very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been enemies with each other. There's one part of that I'm not sure I quite understand why all of a sudden they became friends, because I think Pilate was sending Jesus to Herod to let Herod deal with it. So I'm not exactly sure why Pilate became friends with Herod, because Herod basically said, I'm not dealing with it, send him back to you. So it doesn't really make sense to me why they became friends. Obviously they did, but I'm not sure I understand why. Point again, though, here you had, but again, now you have another person, Herod, who is a higher rank than Pilate, who doesn't want to deal with it either. So he sends him back to Pilate and says, not my problem, it's your problem, take care of it. So now Pilate is back to where he was before. So now Pilate's decision is going to be starting here in 19, verse 5. Jesus came out and wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, behold the man. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of Man. Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was more afraid, and went again back to Jesus and said, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So now again, Pilate has gone back to the Sanhedrin, the council, saying, I still don't know what he's done. I really don't want to do this. He is, again, repeatedly trying the same thing. This is not what I want to be. I don't want to do this. I have no desire to do this. He doesn't really want to kill this. And I think there's multiple reasons why he doesn't really care about Jesus as a person. But he's trying to follow Roman law, and he knows if I do this without justification, it could come back to haunt him, not because of the Jews, but because of his superiors. Could come back and say, why did you execute somebody? You didn't have the authority to execute somebody. He didn't do anything wrong. To Jack's point, he hadn't committed any treason against Rome. So again, he's looking for a way out. That's what I believe, and I think that's how it reads. Then Pilate said to him, are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have a power to crucify you and a power to release you? So Pilate still doesn't know who he's speaking to, doesn't understand who he's speaking to, and he's saying, hey, I have the power to let you go, or I have the power to kill you. But you're not saying anything back to me. Again, some historians believe he's being somewhat sarcastic in this. I sort of believe he's still going, I don't understand what's going on. To Jack's point, I still think he's confused. Why am I here? Why is this man in front of me? I'm giving you the opportunity to tell me, but you're not. But now Jesus is going to let him know. Go ahead.
So, why is it that Pilate had not heard of Jesus or knew his reputation?
He did, but from a standpoint of what it applied to him as a person, he had heard of Jesus. But how it applied to him as a Roman, Jesus was a Jew. And so, yeah, he had most definitely probably heard of Jesus, probably heard good or bad. Obviously, Herod was hoping to meet him. because of things he had heard about this man. So yeah, his reputation had carried to Pilate, but from a perspective of who Pilate was as a Roman, I don't think he really cared. I mean, again, he wasn't a Jew. So not being a Jew, why would I care? I think that's my take. I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts.
I've got just a thought. It's not too much of a distraction, but if I try to imagine Pilate's position here, we just got done with a couple of decades of war in other places where the cultures are very different. You take Afghanistan, for example. You have like United States like military commanders who are more or less in charge of a province. Well, they're not totally in charge. They'll take like the local sheiks, maybe imams or whatever. Now they'll work with them to try and work with the people, because if you upset the people that are already kind of in charge there, well, the people tend to not respond well.
Yep.
They revolt, and that creates an issue. It's not just, there's noise and a ruckus. You gotta spend more money in your troops and supplies, and troops may end up getting killed, and you gotta bring them home in caskets to their parents, and it creates all these other problems, these huge ripple effects. And I imagine it's somewhat similar with Pilate here, whereas you have a different culture, different laws. One reason the Roman government allowed the Jews to keep that was because the Jews had a history of insurrection. It's like, man, if we let them kind of do their own thing here, that's fine. And if you're a good commander, you'll keep the peace and you'll manage everything the way it needs to. So I can see where it's probably difficult. Like, man, these guys are really adamant about it. They're the rulers, of the local population. If I totally go against them, what trouble could arise? But then also, like you're pointing out, not really wanting to, not seeing the problem with Jesus, but also not really caring that much. Like he's a Jew. In the gospel for this time, obviously wasn't even for Gentiles anyways. His information would have been very limited anyways. He just sees some other Jew they want to kill, trying to understand it, but ultimately his overall prerogative or concern is to keep the peace, prevent another insurrection.
Well, what I said earlier, what you just said, he's got two things he's trying to do: keep the peace with the Jews, prevent an insurrection, prevent a revolt. But also, I got to follow Roman law, which Roman law says I got to have a reason to execute this man. And so far, I'm really close to having this resurrection or this revolt or this riot, or I'm really, really close to executing a man. I don't really not have a reason to do it. And it's not like he hasn't executed people before. I mean, again, I don't think he had a conscience about, I don't want to execute an innocent man. It was more about, I'm supposed to uphold Roman law. And if my superiors find out that I'm not doing that, remember, he was powerful. He was become wealthy. He could risk losing that. And more likely, this was a man that he didn't start here from a standpoint of power and wealth. He climbed to that. So he knew, one, he could lose all that and possibly be put to death under Roman law as well if he's not following Roman law. So there's a lot of things that he's trying to balance, to your point.
It kind of seems like that's why he and Herod became friends, because they're both sitting there going, what's wrong with these people? They probably either found fault in him. Both of them are sitting there kind of scratching their heads going, what in the world? They kind of bonded over what in the world are we going to do? And I think, too, you look in Luke, and he doesn't ask him. He says, I will therefore chastise him and release him. Like it's worded a little more strongly there, that, he's not, he's trying to do that to not have to crucify him.
Yep. I agree. I mean, the thing is, again, it's pretty much every account. He's looking for a way to release him, and that's why. Go ahead.
There's two different charges that go back and forth here. Now, Pilate was never told, the scriptures don't tell us, he said, if he didn't do something wrong, we wouldn't have brought him to you. But then, shortly after that, it says, he asked him to be the king of the Jews. So, there had to be some inkling of knowledge that he was king of the Jews. But the Jews were under subjection to the Romans. There was no evidence of a military uprising. So maybe he was of the kingly lineage and
But the interesting part about, so under Jewish law, when he said that they said that he was the Son of God, again, I don't think Pilate cared that he said that, because he's not under Jewish law. So for him, so what? That's not why I put people to death. Now, we're going to find out in a second. We'll read it. Why does he finally crucify him? Why I believe he finally did it? I think there's several reasons. But verse 12, we'll start at 11. So Jesus answered, you could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Verse 12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. So it says from then on. So again, this is continuing. This is not just a instantaneous thing, because it says it says from then on, Pilate sought to release him. So he is still wanting to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in the place that is called the pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Then he delivered him to them to be crucified, and then they took Jesus and led him away. I believe at that point is when he said, I'm crucifying him.
They play the trump card.
Yes, they did.
The trump card is, they are important people in Judea, and they have just threatened. They said, if you release him, we're going to have a committee that's going to go to Rome and tell them that you
Exactly.
have released somebody that threatens the Roman Empire, that says he's king. And he doesn't want that trouble. That's trouble he doesn't need. Rome doesn't deal well with those kind of troubles, if you read your history.
No, they don't want that trouble at all. And they played, to your point, and to Josh's point, that is what point he finally goes, okay, I'm not dealing with this. Because you're about to go to, again, Caesar and tell him that I'm releasing a guy that says that he's over Caesar, which is not what Jesus is saying, but that's what they're threatening him with. And to your point, they have power, and his fear is they're going to go and tell him.
Well, the Jews didn't understand what he was the king of, and neither did Caesar. Okay? He was the king of his kingdom, the church. Heaven, he was going to establish it. It was a lose-lose situation for Pilate. If he had to keep the peace, keep the Jews happy, and keep everything smooth. And God knew that when he sent him out.
Was that the first bell or second bell? I know it's 7:30. And I won't get it. I got more we could say. I agree with everything that's been said. I think, again, as I said earlier, we started this, was when we think about these characters, do we think different after we start thinking and putting ourselves in those shoes? And I know for me, it's real easy to go, man, Pilate was because at the end of the day, Pilate could have just said, all the way back to chapter 18, he could have said, this guy hasn't done anything wrong, let him go. I'm not dealing with you. Out. That's what he could have done. But to your point, Josh, and to what I said earlier and what Jack has said, his big job was to keep the peace, and he'd done that. There was not going to be peace. There would have probably been a revolt. There would have been, they were already somewhat in a mob, so he knew he couldn't do that. So again, he was somewhat stuck between a rock and a hard place. And again, the only really warning he had came from his wife, that had the dream that says, hey, this guy's a just man. So she's trying to warn him, hey, this guy's a just man, don't have anything to do with this. But again, he's somewhat stuck. So I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts. I guess my thought was Pilate, hey, he's still not a good guy. He still did crucify. He still was a cruel man. He could have done some things different. But I think it was a very complicated situation for him that he's trying to figure out how to handle. And I start thinking, if I was in Pilate's shoes, not knowing the things I know, what would I have done different, especially when you consider what he had to lose? Power, wealth, and possibly even his life. So, I mean, he had a lot to lose if he would have done something different.
The only other thing I could think of is that Pilate, I don't know that he had a conscience or not, but in the end, he just said, well, I washed my hands of the whole matter. And that was it. He felt like he had done all he could do, and he wasn't going to do with it, so it was okay.
Yep. Tried to wash his hands of it anyway. One last thing I will point out, and you can actually get a pretty big discussion, but at the very end, when he has crucified Jesus, he's on the cross. There's a lot of people that thoughts are, so he writes on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So typically that would be a person's name and then their crime. That's how they would typically have crucified. Well, all he wrote was Jesus and the King of the Jews. What was the crime? And what did the Jews ask him to do? Don't write that. Take it down. He said, what is written is written. I'm not taking it down. And at that point, my question is, he's now being defiant to the Jews, like, you know what? Y'all made me do this. Well, the charge is what y'all gave. Which charge is, you said he's the King of the Jews, so I'm putting it up there. And they wrote it in 3 separate languages. So there's a part of me, I think, that he also is now at this point somewhat upset, not happy that he was put in a position. I don't think he cared that he killed Jesus. I really don't. Not from a standpoint of, oh, I killed an innocent person. I think the one thing he was probably upset about was, you made me do something that I didn't, this was not something I wanted to do. It's not something that I really should have been doing according to law. I don't think he had a conscience about killing someone. Like, that probably didn't bother him. I don't think he lost sleep because, oh, I murdered somebody. He might have lost sleep because what's the consequences of what I just did? That's my thinking based on what I've read. Anybody else have any more thoughts? Well, I think this is the